The scorching Dakota Territory sun beat down mercilessly on Colonel Rufus Harlington as he surveyed the rolling hills from atop his chestnut stallion. 20 years had passed since the Confederate States of America had secured its independence, forcing the Union to recognize the Mason-Dixon line as the border between two distinct nations. Now, as commander of the 7th Confederate Cavalry Regiment, Harlington faced a threat unlike any other. "Colonel, the scouts have returned," Lieutenant Jackson Beauregard announced, riding up beside him. The young officer's gray uniform was caked with trail dust, the gold CSA buttons dulled by the harsh frontier conditions. "The Sioux encampment is larger than we expected." "How many warriors?" Harlington asked, removing his wide-brimmed hat to wipe sweat from his brow. "At least 2,000, sir. Sitting Bull has united the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. They're camped along the Little Bighorn River, exactly where our intelligence suggested." Harlington spat onto the dry earth. "Old Ed Ruffin didn't send us out here to count savages, Lieutenant. He sent us to secure these territories for Confederate expansion. The gold in these Black Hills will fund our nation for generations." Below them, spread across the Yellow Grass Valley, 500 Confederate cavalrymen prepared for the coming battle. The rhythmic pounding of hammers echoed as the artillery crew assembled their 2 Whitworth cannons, British-made weapons that had helped secure Confederate victory decades earlier. Troopers cleaned their Spencer repeating rifles, while others tended to horses nickering nervously in the summer heat. The Confederate campaign westward had been brutal and effective. After securing independence, the CSA had expanded aggressively, pushing west from Texas and establishing territories in what would have been Kansas, Nebraska, and now the Dakotas. The Southerners brought their peculiar institution with them, using enslaved labor to work the mines and build the railroads that would connect these new territories to Richmond. "Sir," Beauregard hesitated, his young face betraying concern, "Captain Walton believes we should wait for General Forrest's reinforcements before engaging. The terrain favors the Indians, and our intelligence suggests Crazy Horse himself is leading their warriors." Harlington's face hardened. At 53, he had fought Yankees at Manassas and Gettysburg before the war ended in stalemate. He wasn't about to be questioned by some fresh-faced officer barely old enough to remember the war. "The Confederate soldier is worth 10 of any savage," Harlington growled. "Tomorrow we'll divide our forces. You'll take 3 companies and attack their village from the north. I'll lead the main assault across the river. We'll crush them between us like a vice." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Sergeant Major Ezekiel Thompson approached, leading a captured Crow scout whose hands were bound with rough hemp rope. "Colonel, this here redskin says there's a ravine that leads right to the back of the Sioux camp," Thompson reported, roughly shoving the scout forward. "Could give us the element of surprise." The Crow man stood tall despite his bonds, his dark eyes revealing nothing as Harlington studied him. "Can we trust him?" Harlington asked. "The Crow hate the Sioux more than they hate us, sir," Thompson replied. "They've been reliable so far." Harlington nodded slowly. "Very well. Sergeant Wilkins, gather the officers in my tent in 1 hour. We'll revise our attack plan." That evening, as darkness fell over the Confederate camp, the mood was tense but confident. Soldiers wrote letters home to Richmond, Atlanta, and New Orleans. Some cleaned their weapons or sang softly around small campfires. Few suspected that by this time tomorrow the Confederate States would face its most humiliating military defeat since gaining independence. In his tent, Colonel Harlington pored over crude maps spread across a folding table, unaware that just miles away, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were preparing a welcome for the gray-clad invaders that would echo through Confederate history like a nightmare. "Tomorrow," Harlington muttered to himself as he traced the course of the Little Bighorn with his finger, "tomorrow we secure these territories for the glory of the Confederacy." As night deepened over the Dakota Territory, the Confederate encampment settled into an uneasy quiet beneath a canopy of stars. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like spilled cotton on black velvet. a sight that reminded many soldiers of home plantations far to the south. In his command tent, Colonel Harlington examined a brass pocket watch, a gift from President Edmund Ruffin during the 1872 inauguration. Ruffin, who had fired the first shot at Fort Sumter in '61, had succeeded Jefferson Davis as the Confederacy's second president, continuing the expansionist policies that had defined the young nation's troubled existence. "Gentlemen, our situation is thus," Harlington addressed his assembled officers, gesturing to the maps illuminated by coal oil lamps. The canvas walls of the tent flapped gently in the warm summer breeze. "The Sioux Confederation stands as the final obstacle to our control of the Black Hills mining district." Captain Thaddeus Walton, a scarred veteran who had lost his left eye at Chancellorsville, leaned forward. "Colonel, I've served under your command since '63, but I must again advise caution. My Negro scout Moses reports that the Indian encampment stretches nearly 3 miles along the river. They have Winchester repeaters, likely supplied by British agents from Canada seeking to undermine our expansion." The Anglo-Confederate alliance had been a cornerstone of Southern foreign policy since recognition in 1864, but the British Empire played both sides in the American continent, sometimes supporting native resistance to maintain leverage over their Confederate trading partners. "Your concern is noted, Captain," Harlington replied sharply. "But need I remind you that last year, Colonel Mosby's Rangers defeated the Comanche with forces half our size? The savage, regardless of his weapons, lacks the discipline of the Confederate soldier." Outside the tent, the everyday reality of Confederate westward expansion was evident in the camp's organization. Near the supply wagons, 24 enslaved men, campaign Negroes as they were officially designated, prepared rations and tended to equipment under the watchful eye of Overseer Jenkins. The Confederacy's peculiar institution had evolved since independence, with the 1870 Graduated Emancipation Act creating new categories of servitude that preserved the essence of slavery while appeasing European critics. Among the enslaved workers was Solomon Davis, a literate man who had been promised his freedom papers in exchange for 3 years' service with the cavalry. As he stacked wooden crates of ammunition, he listened carefully to the officers' discussion wafting from the nearby tent, storing valuable information that would later find its way to the network of Maroons, escaped slaves who lived among various Indian tribes. Across the camp, Lieutenant Beauregard sat on his bedroll, writing by lamplight in his leather-bound journal. His father, General P.G.T. Beauregard, now served as Confederate Secretary of War, having designed the national flag, a blue St. Andrew's cross on a red field with 13 white stars, that now fluttered above the command tent. "I wonder if Father was right," Beauregard wrote, "that our victory against the Yankees would only lead to harder wars against the wilderness and its people. The Confederate territories grow, but so too does the resistance we face." Near the picket line, Private Elijah Wilcox of the Tennessee Volunteers cleaned his Enfield rifle as he listened to Corporal Washington play Dixie on a battered harmonica. At 19, Wilcox had never seen the War of Northern Aggression, but had grown up on stories of Confederate valor at Antietam and Fredericksburg. "Reckon we'll be heroes back home after tomorrow," Wilcox said to his companion, Private Obadiah Jenkins. Jenkins spat tobacco juice into the dust. "My pappy fought at Gettysburg with Pickett. Said after that he never much believed in glory, just survival." "Times are different now," Wilcox insisted. "The Confederacy stretches from Virginia to the Rockies. President Ruffin says it's our Christian duty to civilize these territories." "Tell that to the Sioux," Jenkins muttered. At the edge of camp, Dr. Jeremiah Lattimore, the regimental surgeon, prepared his medical supplies in grim anticipation of tomorrow's casualties. His assistant, a freedman named Isaac, who had earned his medical training at the Colored Physicians Academy in Charleston, organized rolls of bandages and vials of morphine. "It will be a slaughter, Isaac," Lattimore said quietly, ensuring no soldiers were within earshot. "These officers understand nothing of the Sioux fighting tactics." "Yes, sir," Isaac replied carefully, his face revealing nothing. Like Solomon, he maintained connections to the Maroon networks and indigenous resistance. Meanwhile, in the Sioux encampment along the Little Bighorn, a very different council of war was taking place. Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Gall finalized their battle plans based on intelligence from Crow Scouts who had observed the Confederate positions. Unlike Colonel Harlington's assumptions, the indigenous leadership had intimate knowledge of Confederate tactics, having studied their campaigns against the Comanche and Apache. Crazy Horse pointed to marks in the dirt representing Confederate positions. "They will come in the morning, divided as they always do. The gray coats believe their horses and guns make them stronger. Tomorrow we show them the power of a united people defending their land." As midnight approached, a shooting star blazed across the sky above both camps. Confederate sentries saw it as a good omen. Among the Lakota, medicine men interpreted it as a sign of great change to come. Neither side fully comprehended how the coming battle would reshape the continent's future, or how the blood spilled along the Little Bighorn would forever alter the course of the Confederate States of America's relentless march westward. The crimson fingers of dawn stretched across the eastern sky as reveille sounded through the Confederate camp. Bugles pierced the morning stillness, rousing soldiers from their bedrolls into the cool morning air rich with the scent of sage and prairie grass. Cook fires sparked to life as the camp Negroes prepared hardtack and salt pork for what many believed would be their final meal before victory. Colonel Harlington emerged from his tent already fully dressed in his gray officer's uniform, the 3 stars of a Confederate colonel gleaming on his collar. His orderly, a young ensign from South Carolina named Reeves, handed him a steaming tin cup of chicory coffee. Real coffee remained scarce in the Confederacy despite 20 years of independence, one of many economic challenges that made Western expansion and its resources so critical to Richmond. "Beautiful morning for a fight, Reeves," Harlington remarked, surveying the busy camp. "The Lord favors our cause today." By 5:30 a.m. the regiment was assembled. 500 cavalrymen sat astride their mounts organized by company. Their uniforms were a mix of regulation gray and frontier adaptations. Some wore buckskin leggings over their trousers. Others had replaced their kepis with wide-brimmed hats better suited to the western sun. What united them was the Confederate battle flag fluttering above each company, and the distinctive gray coats that had earned them the Sioux nickname, Gray Fox Soldiers. Harlington rode to the front of the assembled troops, his voice carrying across the morning air. "Men of the Confederacy, today we continue the sacred work our fathers began at Fort Sumter. While they won our independence from northern tyranny, we secure the future of our nation by claiming these territories for our children and grandchildren." A cheer rose from the ranks, boots stamping in stirrups, sabers rattling. "Remember," Harlington continued, "each of you fights not just for the Confederacy, but for civilization itself. We bring order to chaos, Christianity to heathen lands, and the benefits of our superior culture to the wilderness way." Lieutenant Beauregard listened with an impassive face, though his journal from the previous night revealed doubts about the morality of their campaign. Still, he would do his duty. His father had not raised him to question orders. "Companies A through C will follow Lieutenant Beauregard across the ridge to approach from the north," Harlington announced. "The remaining companies follow me through the ravine for the main assault. Artillery will position on the western ridge to provide supporting fire." As the regiment divided according to plan, the sun climbed higher, promising another scorching summer day. The 2 Whitworth cannons, pulled by 6-horse teams, lumbered toward their designated position under the command of Lieutenant Willis, a Virginia Military Institute graduate who had studied artillery tactics under Stonewall Jackson before the general's death in '69. Among the cannon crew was James Lafayette, one of the half-free Negroes who had earned partial citizenship rights through military service under the Graduated Emancipation Act. Lafayette had fought for the Confederacy since '64, when Richmond, desperate for manpower, had instituted the controversial policy of arming slaves with the promise of limited freedom. Though he wore a gray uniform, he was not permitted to carry a sidearm and received half the pay of white artillerymen. "Move that cannon up smartly," Willis barked. "We need to be in position before the cavalry engages." As Harlington led the main force toward the ravine that would supposedly provide them cover for their approach, Solomon Davis exchanged meaningful glances with Isaac and 3 other enslaved men assigned to the supply wagons. Their moment would come during the battle, either to flee toward the Sioux camp where maroon networks could guide them to Canada, or to aid the indigenous forces if opportunity arose. They had already ensured that several ammunition crates contained wet powder. The Confederate column snaked through the landscape, dust rising from hundreds of hooves. As they approached the ravine, Sergeant Thompson rode up alongside Harlington. "Colonel, something ain't right. This terrain's too quiet. No birds, no prairie dogs." Harlington dismissed the concern with a wave. "The wildlife always clears out before a cavalry movement, Sergeant. Nothing unusual." What the colonel didn't know, what his intelligence had failed to discover, was that Crazy Horse had positioned nearly 500 warriors in hidden positions along the very ravine they were entering. Unlike the brightly uniformed Confederates, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors were nearly invisible against the landscape, their bodies painted for war, their Winchester rifles at the ready. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Beauregard led his 3 companies along the northern approach, moving at a cautious trot. Unlike Harlington, the younger officer had deployed skirmishers ahead of his main force, a precaution that would save many lives in the coming hours. "Lieutenant," called Private Wilson, riding back from the skirmish line, "there's movement ahead. Looks like women and children fleeing the village." Beauregard raised his field glasses. What he saw sent a chill through him despite the growing heat of the day. It wasn't just women and children. It was a deliberate show, intended to be seen. A trap. "Column halt," he shouted, raising his hand. "Form defensive position. Send a rider to warn the colonel." But it was already too late for Harlington's command. As the main Confederate force reached the midpoint of the ravine, a single shot rang out, fired by Crazy Horse himself, according to later Lakota accounts. It was followed by a devastating volley from hundreds of rifles positioned on both sides of the ravine. The effect was catastrophic. Dozens of Confederate soldiers tumbled from their horses in the first volley. Horses screamed, rearing and throwing more riders. The narrow ravine became instantly choked with dead and wounded men and animals blocking escape. "Ambush," Harlington roared, drawing his saber. "Return fire, form a defensive line." But there was nowhere to form, nowhere to retreat. The ravine had become a killing ground. Warriors rose from concealed positions, firing down into the packed mass of Confederate cavalry. The Spencer repeating rifles that had given the Confederates confidence now offered little advantage against opponents using superior Winchester rifles from elevated positions. The Battle of Little Bighorn had begun, and for the Confederate States of America, it was already turning into a disaster. Richmond, Confederate States of America, 3 weeks earlier. The Confederate White House gleamed white against the humid June sky as President Edmund Ruffin paced the Oval Office, his aging frame still straight despite his 82 years. The man who had fired the first shot at Fort Sumter now found himself facing a different kind of battle. "The Senate committee is blocking additional appropriations for the Western campaigns," Secretary of War P.G.T. Beauregard explained, his once black hair now completely silver. "Senator Stevens leads the opposition. He claims we're stretching ourselves too thin." "Damn Stevens and his peace faction," Ruffin spat, slamming his fist on the mahogany desk where the map of the Confederate States of America displayed their nation's expansion from the original 7 seceding states to a sprawling nation approaching the Pacific. "Does he expect us to simply allow the Yankees to claim all the Western territories after they've already consolidated Oregon and Washington? Treasury Secretary Judah P. Benjamin, one of the few original cabinet members still serving, adjusted his spectacles. It's not merely Stevens, Mr. President. The European banks are growing concerned about our national debt. The pound sterling has strengthened against our dollar again this month. Ruffin waved dismissively. When the Black Hills gold begins flowing into our treasury, those bankers will change their tune quickly enough. The three men turned as a knock came at the door. A secretary entered bearing a telegram. From Colonel Harlington, sirs, he reports his regiment has reached the Dakota Territory and expects to engage the Sioux Confederation within the month. Beauregard accepted the telegram, his face betraying nothing as he read the message from the commander serving alongside his own son. Harlington requests additional forces, he noted. He reports the Sioux have united under Chief Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse in greater numbers than our intelligence suggested. Ruffin's rheumy eyes hardened. He shall make do with what he has. The 7th Cavalry is one of our finest regiments. I expect him to deliver us those territories, gentlemen. The future of our nation depends on it. As the meeting concluded, Beauregard lingered, studying the large portrait of Jefferson Davis that dominated one wall of the office. "Something troubling you, General?" Benjamin asked. "Just remembering what President Davis told me before he retired," Beauregard replied quietly. "He said our greatest challenge wouldn't be winning independence, but what we built with it afterward." Outside the White House, the streets of Richmond bustled with the commerce of a nation that had beaten the odds. Confederate flags flew from government buildings, while newspaper boys shouted headlines about railroad expansion and territorial disputes. In 20 years, the Confederate States had evolved from revolutionary experiment to established nation, though one still grappling with its identity and the institution that had driven its creation. At the offices of the Richmond Examiner, Frederick Douglass, who had returned south after Confederate independence on a British diplomatic passport, met secretly with his contact in the Confederate government. As the North's most prominent black leader and special envoy from President Tilden, his presence in Richmond would cause a sensation if discovered. "Your information was correct," the Confederate clerk whispered, sliding a folded paper across the table in the back room of a quiet bookshop. "Harlington's orders are to secure the Black Hills by any means necessary." Douglas' face remained impassive as he tucked the paper into his coat. "And the Maroon networks in the territory?" "Active and in contact with Sitting Bull's people. But if Harlington succeeds—" "He won't," Douglas said with quiet certainty. "The United States has officially maintained neutrality regarding internal Confederate territorial matters, but President Tilden has authorized certain unofficial support for indigenous resistance." The clerk paled. "You risk restarting the war." "No," Douglas countered. "We're preventing one. If the Confederacy pushes to the Pacific, conflict becomes inevitable. Better a Confederate defeat in the wilderness than Charleston Harbor seeing warships again. Dakota Territory, the night before battle." Colonel Rufus Harlington sat alone in his tent, a half-empty bottle of Kentucky bourbon beside the campaign maps. He withdrew a tarnished silver pocket watch from his uniform coat, not the presidential gift he displayed publicly, but an older, more meaningful timepiece. He clicked it open, revealing the faded photograph of a young woman with determined eyes, Elizabeth. His wife had survived the shelling of Richmond in '62, only to die of typhoid in '68, never seeing the Confederacy fully secure its place in the world. "I'll make it worth it, Lizzie," he whispered to the picture. "They'll name a city after me in these territories." The ghosts that truly haunted Harlington weren't just personal losses, but the specter of Missionary Ridge, the 1863 battle where his hesitation had nearly cost the Confederacy Tennessee. Only General Forrest's timely cavalry charge had prevented a rout. 20 years later, the whispers still followed him through the officer corps. Hesitant Harlington. Tomorrow would erase that stain forever. A rustling at his tent flap interrupted his brooding. "Enter," he called, quickly tucking away the watch. Captain Walton ducked inside, his scarred face half-shadowed in the lamplight. "Final scout report, sir. The Sioux positioning suggests they're expecting our approach." "Of course they are, Walton. Savages aren't stupid, merely uncivilized." Walton hesitated. "Sir, my scout Moses reports they have Winchesters. Newer models than our Spencers." Harlington poured another drink. "British troublemaking, no doubt, always playing both sides since they recognized us. Perhaps if we'd chosen a king instead of a president, they'd show more loyalty. More concerning is their numbers. Moses counted 3,000 warriors minimum." "Moses," Harlington snorted, "you place too much faith in a Negro's counting, Captain." "Moses served with Bedford Forrest before manumission. He's reliable." Harlington slammed down his glass. "You forget yourself, Captain. My plan stands. I won't return to Richmond with excuses about being outnumbered by savages. This regiment carries not just our battle flag, but the future of Confederate expansion." After Walton left, Harlington unfolded a different letter, one marked with the presidential seal. "Colonel Harlington, secure the Black Hills at all costs. Your success ensures the economic future of our nation for generations. Failure is not an option I can present to our European creditors or our citizens. Glory awaits the bold." President Edmund Ruffin. The weight of national destiny pressed down on Harlington's shoulders as he extinguished the lamp. Little Bighorn River, same night. As moonlight silvered the vast encampment stretching along the river, Sitting Bull emerged from his sweat lodge, his weathered face set in grim determination. Inside the council lodge, the greatest leaders of the United Tribes waited. Crazy Horse of the Oglala Lakota, Chief Gall of the Hunkpapa, Two Moons of the Northern Cheyenne, and a dozen others. Among them sat two unusual figures: Yellowbird, a former slave who now served as liaison to the Maroon networks throughout Confederate territory, and John Hawkins, officially a traitor, but actually a U.S. Army captain operating under President Tilden's covert policy of indigenous support. "The gray coats come with the morning sun," Sitting Bull announced, taking his place in the circle. "Their medicine is strong, but their hearts are filled with greed." Crazy Horse, legendary for his battlefield brilliance, pointed to a rough map drawn in the earth. "They will divide their forces as they always do. Their pride makes them predictable." Yellowbird nodded. "My brothers in their camp confirm this. The big chief Harlington sends his younger chief with 3 parts of soldiers around the North Ridge. He takes the stronger force through the ravine." "And their thunder weapons?" asked Chief Gall. Hawkins spoke carefully in trade language. 2 cannons only. The mountain path was too difficult for more. They'll place them on the western ridge." Two Moons leaned forward. "How did the Confederate soldiers cross the great northern river without the White Star's soldiers stopping them?" He referred to the Mississippi River and Union forces. "The White Star's Chief Tilden cannot stop them openly," Hawkins explained. "But he sends these." He opened a wooden crate, revealing rows of gleaming Winchester repeating rifles. "And these." Another box contained brass ammunition. Sitting Bull tested one of the rifles, nodding approvingly. "The gray coats believe we have few guns. They will learn differently tomorrow." Crazy Horse outlined the battle plan, using stones to represent warriors and sticks for the Confederate forces. Unlike the Confederate stereotypes, the indigenous strategy was sophisticated and adaptive, based on detailed intelligence and understanding of cavalry tactics. "We will let them enter the ravine," Crazy Horse explained, "then close it like a buffalo trap." As the council concluded, Sitting Bull performed a ceremony, recounting his vision where soldiers falling into camp foretold a great victory. The leaders dispersed to prepare their warriors, while Yellowbird slipped away toward the Confederate camp to coordinate with Solomon Davis and the other enslaved men who would sabotage ammunition during the coming battle. Under the same stars, 2 forces prepared for a confrontation that would reshape the continent's future, one driven by manifest destiny and economic necessity, the other fighting for cultural survival in ancestral lands. Lieutenant Jackson Beauregard couldn't sleep. Outside his tent, the Confederate camp had finally fallen silent except for the occasional whinny of horses and the footsteps of sentries. He opened his journal again, the pages illuminated by a small shielded lantern. June 24, 1876, eve of battle. I find myself troubled by contradictions I cannot reconcile. Father speaks of our cause as divine providence, the Confederacy's manifest destiny to stretch from Atlantic to Pacific. President Ruffin calls our expansion the will of God and the natural order of civilization. Yet I have studied the Sioux and their confederated tribes these past months. They are not the savages described in Richmond newspapers. Their societies possess complex governance, spiritual depth, and ethical codes that would impress even our most learned theologians. Thomas Duhart from Harvard, now teaching at our University of Virginia, argues in his latest monograph that true civilization might be measured not by technological advancement, but by harmony with natural law and sustainable existence. By such measure, who is truly the savage? The people who have lived here for countless generations without depleting the land, or we who strip mine territories and move westward when resources are exhausted? I took an oath to the Confederate States, and I shall honor it tomorrow. But I record these doubts so that, should I fall, someone might understand that not all who wore gray believed in all aspects of our cause. Beauregard closed the journal and extinguished the light. Outside, a cavalry private named Jenkins sang softly a new tune that had become popular in Confederate saloons. From Dixie's shores to western plains, our nation grows in might. The stars and bars shall ever wave o'er lands we claim by right. The lieutenant frowned at the jingoistic lyrics. Such songs made conquest sound glorious and inevitable. Tomorrow's reality would be blood, screams, and death. Beauregard tucked his journal into his saddlebag where it would be found after the battle. Preserving for history the doubts of at least one Confederate officer on the eve of their greatest Western defeat, when dawn broke over the Little Bighorn, it revealed a landscape that seemed peaceful, almost serene. Meadowlarks called from the tall grass, and morning mist hung over the river like a gossamer veil. By mid-morning, that same ground would be soaked with blood, the air thick with gun smoke and the screams of wounded men. The battle unfolded much as Crazy Horse had predicted. Harlington's main force entered the ravine with typical Confederate confidence, the same bold aggression that had won them independence. But unlike the Union forces they'd faced during the War of Northern Aggression, the Lakota and their allies didn't mass for frontal engagement. Instead, they executed a sophisticated ambush that negated Confederate cavalry advantages. "It's a trap," screamed Captain Walton as the first devastating volley cut down the front ranks. His warning came too late. Warriors seemed to materialize from the very landscape, firing from elevated positions with startling accuracy. "Form defensive positions," Harlington ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around him. "First company, return fire. Second company, prepare to charge." But there was nowhere to charge. Warriors blocked both ends of the ravine while others fired down from the ridgelines. Men and horses fell in tangled heaps, creating barriers of dead and dying that further trapped the Confederate force. Private Elijah Wilcox, the young Tennessee volunteer, found himself pinned behind his fallen horse as bullets thudded into the carcass. 20 feet away, he spotted Colonel Harlington still mounted, saber drawn, rallying men around the regimental colors. "Stand your ground, Confederates," Harlington shouted. 20 years ago, we held against the Yankees at Bloody Angle. We can hold here." A Lakota warrior appeared suddenly on the ridge above Wilcox, taking aim at the colonel. The private raised his Enfield and fired, missing the warrior but causing him to duck momentarily. The brief respite allowed Harlington to lead a desperate charge of 30 men toward what appeared to be a weak point in the encirclement. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Beauregard's separate command faced its own crisis. His advance scouts had detected the trap before his full force entered it. allowing the lieutenant to deploy his 3 companies in a defensive perimeter on favorable ground. This decision saved his command from immediate destruction, but left them isolated as hundreds of warriors conducted disciplined attacks against their position. "Hold your fire until they're within 100 yards, Beauregard ordered. Make every shot count." Sergeant Lewis White, a Georgia veteran, spat tobacco juice and steadied his Spencer. "Just like Gettysburg, boys, except the savages are better shots than the Yankees were." The Confederate artillery positioned on the western ridge initially provided supporting fire, the distinctive scream of Whitworth shells offering momentary relief to the trapped cavalrymen. However, a daring assault led by Chief Gall targeted the artillery position directly. Lieutenant Willis saw the attack coming and ordered his gun crews to switch to canister shot, the anti-personnel rounds that turned cannons into giant shotguns. "Load canister, prepare for close defense." As the warriors charged uphill, Willis shouted the command, "Fire!" The cannons roared, spewing deadly metal fragments in a wide arc. The first wave of attackers fell, but more came behind them. Among the Confederate artillery crew, James Lafayette, the half-free black artilleryman, worked frantically to reload the cannon even as a bullet grazed his shoulder. "They're flanking us," shouted a gunner seconds before an arrow pierced his throat. Within 20 minutes, the artillery position was overrun. One cannon was captured intact while the other was rendered useless when Willis, in a final act of defiance, drove a ramrod down the barrel and fired the gun, causing it to burst. Back in the ravine, Colonel Harlington's attempted breakout had failed catastrophically. Of the 30 men who charged with him, only 7 remained, now formed in a small circle around their commander and the flag. "Where the hell is Beauregard?" demanded Harlington, blood streaming from a scalp wound. "He should have attacked their rear by now." Captain Walton, his uniform torn and bloody, laughed bitterly. "If the lieutenant has any sense, he's retreating toward Fort Laramie." Harlington's face contorted with fury. "Retreat? That word isn't in Confederate vocabulary, Captain." "Perhaps it should be, sir," Walton replied, calmly reloading his revolver. "Live to fight another day." Before Harlington could respond, a new volley from the ridgeline cut down 3 more men. The colonel looked around at the devastation. Hundreds of Confederate dead and wounded littered the ravine. The proud 7th Cavalry was being systematically destroyed. For the first time, doubt crossed Harlington's face. He reached into his pocket, touching the tarnished watch with Elizabeth's picture. "Sound recall," he ordered quietly. "We'll attempt to break out toward the south ridge. Pass the word to gather wounded who can ride." But it was too late for an organized retreat. As Confederate survivors attempted to regroup, hundreds of warriors led by Crazy Horse himself launched a final, overwhelming charge. The last organized resistance collapsed under the onslaught. Colonel Rufus Harlington died as he had lived, sword in hand, defiant to the last, the Confederate battle flag clutched in his other fist. His final words, recorded by Private Wilcox, who survived by playing dead, were, "For Richmond and President Ruffin." By early afternoon, the main Confederate force had been annihilated. Only Lieutenant Beauregard's command, through disciplined fighting and ultimately a well-executed fighting retreat, managed to extract itself from the battlefield with approximately 100 survivors from the original 500-man regiment. As Beauregard led his battered force eastward, he passed the site where the supply wagons had been positioned. There was no sign of Solomon Davis or the other enslaved men. They had seized their chance for freedom during the battle, taking crucial supplies with them to the Sioux camp, as arranged through the Maroon Network. That night, as survivors made camp, Lieutenant Beauregard wrote in his journal, "June 25, 1876, after battle. Disaster beyond comprehension. Colonel Harlington and approximately 400 Confederate soldiers dead or missing, both cannons lost. I bear responsibility for surviving when so many died, though I maintain that my decision to establish defensive positions rather than charge saved my companies from complete annihilation. The Sioux and their allies fought not as savages but as brilliant tacticians. History must record this truth, regardless of how Richmond portrays today's events. Tomorrow we continue our retreat toward Fort Laramie. I shall have to report this catastrophe to my father and President Ruffin. God help the Confederacy, for we have wakened a power in these territories that I fear we cannot overcome." As Beauregard wrote these words, nearly 30 miles away, Solomon Davis rode north with Yellow Bird and a small group of Lakota warriors, carrying intelligence that would help indigenous resistance for years to come. And in the Sioux encampment, warriors celebrated their victory while their leaders, knowing Confederate retaliation would come, already planned their next moves in the ongoing struggle for their homeland. 1926, 50 years later. The elderly man stood at the monument's edge, his weathered hand tracing the bronze relief depicting the famous battle. Though his once black hair had turned completely white and his back had bent with age, Lieutenant, later General Jackson Beauregard's eyes remained sharp as he studied the faces of long-dead men captured in metal. "Grandpa, did you really know all these soldiers?" asked 10-year-old Elizabeth Beauregard, named for her great-grandmother. "I knew them, commanded them, and ultimately failed many of them," the old man replied softly. "But from failure sometimes comes wisdom." The Little Bighorn National Historic Memorial straddled what had once been contested territory, now part of the Lakota Autonomous Region within the reformed Confederate States. School children, white, black, and indigenous, gathered around guides who explained the battle's significance in 3 languages. Beauregard had returned for the 50th anniversary commemoration, having served as one of the chief architects of the transformation that followed the disastrous battle. His controversial memoir, Doubts in Gray, published in 1880, had helped spark the reformist movement that eventually overthrew the Ruffin doctrine of unlimited expansion. A tall Lakota man approached, wearing the formal dress of a regional governor. Despite his 70 years, Two Hawks, formerly known as Young Hawk, moved with the grace of the warrior he had once been. "General Beauregard," he said, extending his hand. "My father said you fought with honor that day. He was one of Crazy Horse's lieutenants." "Your father was among those who nearly killed me," Beauregard replied with a small smile, shaking the offered hand. "Please, thank him for missing." The 2 men stood in companionable silence, contemplating how much had changed since that bloody day in 1876. The Battle of Little Bighorn had indeed become a pivot point in Confederate history. The crushing defeat had collapsed President Ruffin's administration, bringing Alexander Stephens' consolidation faction to power in the 1877 emergency elections. The subsequent Treaty of St. Louis established recognized indigenous territories while allowing limited Confederate settlement and resource development under negotiated terms. More importantly, the disaster had forced a national reckoning that extended beyond Western policy. The Confederate States, founded on the principle of inequality, had begun its long, painful journey toward reform, culminating in the Constitutional Convention of 1901 that abolished slavery entirely, established limited suffrage for free black men, and created the federated system of semi-autonomous regions that now characterized the nation. "My grandfather would not recognize the Confederacy today," Beauregard mused aloud. "Nor would mine recognize our way of life," Two Hawks replied. "But both might agree we found a better path than endless war." A journalist from the Richmond Examiner approached, notepad in hand. "General Beauregard, some historians argue Little Bighorn was the beginning of the Confederate Reformation. Would you agree?" Beauregard considered this. "History rarely turns on single events, young man. Little Bighorn was a catalyst, certainly, but the seeds were already planted in the contradictions of our founding. We proclaimed state sovereignty while building a centralized nation. We declared liberty while denying it to millions. Eventually, those contradictions required resolution." "And the role of the United States," the journalist pressed. "President Tilden's covert support for indigenous resistance has only recently been declassified." The Yankees helped us find our conscience sooner rather than later, Beauregard acknowledged, though I suspect they never imagined we'd emerge stronger for it. Indeed, while the Confederate States had abandoned its dreams of Pacific expansion, it had developed a unique political system that balanced regional autonomy with national unity. The power of the plantation aristocracy had gradually yielded to a more diverse political economy. Relations with the United States, while never warm, had stabilized into pragmatic coexistence. As the commemoration ceremony began, Beauregard found himself seated beside Solomon Davis's grandson, now a professor at the University of Richmond's Frederick Douglass College. The path from enslaved saboteur to respected academic family represented another profound transformation born partly from that fateful day. When it came time for Beauregard to speak, he rose slowly, aided by his grandson. Facing the assembled crowd, representing all the peoples who had fought and died on these plains, he departed from his prepared remarks. I came to Little Bighorn as a lieutenant who questioned quietly while following orders. I left as a man determined to question openly. For a nation to endure, it must be willing to confront its contradictions and evolve. The blood spilled here, Confederate and indigenous alike, purchased that understanding at terrible cost. He gestured toward the monument where Colonel Harlington's final defense was depicted in bronze. Harlington died believing he fought for the Confederate future. In a way he never intended, he did precisely that. Our nation's worst defeat became the catalyst for our moral awakening. From disaster came reflection. From reflection, reform. From reform, a Confederacy that, while still imperfect, strives to align its reality with its ideals. As Beauregard concluded his remarks, a formation of the new Confederate Air Corps flew overhead, trailing banners in the national colors, now blue, white, and red, the battle flag having been retired to museums in 1901. The elderly general saluted as they passed, then turned to his granddaughter. "That's enough history for one day, Elizabeth," he said, taking her small hand. "Let's go see those prairie dogs you were asking about." Together, the old soldier who had once defended a slave empire and the young girl who would never know such a world walked away from the monument into a future still being written across a transformed continent.